Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you at this ISP event on Arab normalization with Damascus, what implications for the Syrian conflict. This event is hosted in the framework of the Rome Dialogue's 8th edition, which will be held between the 1st and the 3rd of December this year. My name is Chiara Levotti. I'm a research fellow at ISP, and I'm honored to be moderating a panel featuring 3 stellar experts of Syria and the Middle East. Allow me just a 1 minute, very short overview on the topic that we will be discussing today. This idea of Arab normalization with regard to Syria has been with us for a while now, 11 years after the start of the war, which led to Syria's suspension from the Arab League and thus Syria's marginalization on the international arena. Several Middle East governments have taken steps towards the rehabilitation of Syria, of the Syrian regime into the system of regional politics. In the past few months, we've seen Syrian ministers and officials have resumed meetings with their regional counterparts. For instance, state visits seem to be resuming as well. A significant event clearly to this regard has been Bashar al-Assad's visit in mid-March to the United Arab Emirates and the first visit of the Syrian president to an Arab country since the war has begun, and then also trade between Syria and other Arab governments of the region and beyond is expected to grow in the upcoming few years. But as you know, these developments that are taking place at the level of macro politics, at the level of relations among regional powers, they do not reflect stable improvements on the ground. They do not reflect an end of the conflict, and they certainly do not reflect a normalization, if you will, in the lives of millions of Syrians. As you know much better than me, the conflict remains stagnant. No sustainable political solution is yet in sight. Millions of Syrians remain displaced outside and within the country, and international agencies are perennially confronted with the lack of resources for emergency relief and the lack of safe corridors to guarantee access to existing resources. On top of that, as you can imagine, in the interconnected world we live in, any local crisis have global impacts, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the terrible war that is taking place in Eastern Europe and will probably last for a while, is affecting already and will affect Syria profoundly. Even more so as Russia has been one of the most determinant actors in shaping the destiny of the Syrian conflict, the most determinant one outside the region, perhaps. With the rise of global wheat prices, global fuel prices, and the possibility of a Russian veto on the renewal of cross-border aid coming from countries in the region becoming more and more concrete, Syria's 11-year-old humanitarian disaster risks being further exacerbated. Against this backdrop, in what way have the latest steps towards the reintegration of Damascus into the Arab regional system influence the prospects for a political solution for the country? What consequences is the Ukraine war likely to have for the diplomacy of the Syrian conflict? And what steps should the international community take to cope with the worsening humanitarian conditions in this tormented country? We will address these questions with our speakers. Then pleased to introduce Lina Khatib, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, Charles Lister, Director of Syria and Counterterrorism and Extremism Programs of the Middle East Institute, and Jihad Yazigi, Editor-in-Chief of the Syria Report. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for being with us today. A very short technical note before starting. We will go for a couple of rounds of interventions from our speakers, and then we will open to Q&A from the audience. So I'm saying this to our participants in the audience. You can start to drop your questions in the chat since the beginning or later as you prefer, and I will convey them to the speakers. So with no further ado, I would start with you, Lina, if I may. And I would ask you to guide us through this very idea of Arab normalization, quote unquote, as I was saying. What factors have contributed to the most recent developments in the process of the Arab government's rapprochement to Damascus? What countries have been at the forefront of these attempts at rehabilitating the Syrian regime, and what countries have been opposing it? If you can draw us a picture of what does the regional context look like, how are regional powers looking at Syria 11 years into the war, and if you can keep your question, your answer, sorry, within 5 to 6, 7 minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, no problem, and thank you for having me here. So the big picture looks like some countries in the Gulf, mainly the UAE, are heading in the direction of some sort of normalization. And other countries in the Gulf, namely Saudi Arabia, are still quite resistant to normalization. And you can split the rest of the region according to which countries would benefit from this normalization or otherwise, and which countries have always really had normal relations with Syria, but downgraded them for all kinds of factors. The countries that have basically been quite vocal against normalization are a handful, Qatar being one of them, for instance. So when it comes to the countries that have kind of not normalized, but in a way reduced their engagement, we can count Jordan. They never cut diplomatic relations, but they kind of reduced the extent of interaction. UAE is now spearheading what can be seen as normalization. But even though UAE and Jordan look very different in terms of what they're doing, with Jordan not being as flamboyant, I guess, as UAE. For example, UAE, we had a high-level meeting with Assad happening in UAE, whereas that, did not happen in Jordan. The King of Jordan has not met with Bashar al-Assad. However, in both cases, the key driver, I would say, is domestic rather than being something coming out of Syria. So it's not like these two countries, for instance, are normalizing because they see lucrative business opportunities in Syria or because they want to necessarily help Syria. They're doing it because of domestic drivers. In Jordan, the low-level kind of push towards increasing the extent of engagement, I would put it that way, because the term normalization doesn't quite work in the context of Jordan, is mainly driven by Jordanian business people who thought that maybe having this increased engagement would bring them more profits. But that's not going to work for them because of US sanctions and European sanctions, which remain in place, which basically will limit the extent of any business interaction between outside entities and Syrians, because then they would end up crossing the sanctions line. When it comes to UAE, the driver is also to do with UAE, because UAE is very ambitious. It wants to be seen as a regional leader. And it is doing this in a way that shows that it can have relations with not necessarily everyone, but with most countries in the region. And I would say in all cases that, and this is something that perhaps Charles can talk more about, the key thing for me here is the driver behind the domestic driver, which is US foreign policy. Ultimately, we have the US having led a lot of its partners in the region to believe that it was on the side of regime change in Syria. That has not materialized. And also the way the US has been focusing mainly on Iran, while in a way putting aside other issues in the region like Syria, has also made countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE try to find their own way of dealing with this issue. And they're doing it in different ways. However, will we see the Syrian Arab Republic present at the Arab League anytime soon? I will say no. And that's because Saudi Arabia is still resistant to normalization, despite some low-level interactions, such as meetings to discuss the drug smuggling problem in the region, or very recently, there were media reports about a Syrian television series shown on a Saudi channel. I would say, as long as Saudi Arabia remains resistant to normalization, we are not going to see normalization. And when it comes to understanding normalization, it's about the interest of the countries normalizing rather than about what's actually happening in Syria itself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lina. I do agree, actually. We will inquire, Charles, about the US foreign policy in a bit. But as you suggest, let's stick to the local context. You underlined the importance of Syrian politics itself in this process. And I would like to ask Jihad, what do recent developments in the normalization process mean for Damascus? How Damascus sees this process? And I would ask also to focus on the economic aspects. For those who don't know it, the Syria report is one of the most accurate sources of information on Syria's economic landscape. Will this process of normalization, of reintegration of Syria in the Arab regional system be able to sustain Syria's economic recovery? What do you think? Please, Jihad.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for having me today, having me here. Well, actually, obviously, the visit of Bashar to the UAE was seen very positively among regime loyalists in Damascus. There was some hopes that this would open the way for deeper, inclusion of reintegration of Syria, if you want, to the Arab League and to the Arab political system, if you want. As of today, I largely agree with Lina. I don't see this opening, if you want, deepening very much. One needs to remember that UAE reopened its embassy in Damascus more than 3 years ago. The speed at which relations are advancing between Syria and other Arab countries is very slow, very low. Jordan is a typical case, the borders having reopened, but being very frequently closed for a lot of different reasons. And I think one also very important thing to realize is that obviously the Syrian economy is very much in need of financial support. The economic situation is extremely difficult, particularly, obviously there's the impact of the conflict, but since the end of 2019, there's a collapse of the Lebanese banking sector, which has had a very significant impact on the economy. But the fact is that even if we were to suppose today that the UAE were to throw in $1 billion, $2 billion into the Syrian economy, I personally doubt very much this would have any significant impact, if you want. The Syrian economy is largely collapsed. The main business individuals who play a significant role in the business community of Damascus, of Aleppo, have left the country or have been largely sidelined. And these are usually very important intermediary for foreign investor, for big projects at least. The banks, Syrian banks, they don't loan. They are largely seeking to actually reduce their activity rather than increase it because of Western sanctions. And so the overall atmosphere in Syria is not at all inducive, if you want, or won't help in any way profit from any capital inflow from the Gulf or any other country. On top of that, of course, you have the Caesar Act. We just had, after the UAE visit and information in the Syrian media that the UAE were to invest in some projects, you had the US ranking, the Senate Foreign Committee ranking member, Mr. Risch, I think his name is, who was protesting this attempt by the UAE or this information of UAE investment in Syria. So I think it's very unlikely that we are going to see any significant inflow. And of course, the hope that UAE investment involvement in Syria is a means to reduce the influence of Iran is also largely mistaken. I don't think they have the capacity to do this. I don't think even that Bashar or the regime has the capacity to take any step distancing himself from Iran. So I really can't see anything significant happening. And one has to say also that all these attempts at normalization, but these are not new. As I said, the embassy opened in 2018. You had some attempts with Lebanon. You had some visits here and there. You have the Omanis with whom contacts have always been open. But if you want, the second step in that normalization has never happened and is not happening. So I can't see this normalization going any further. And I don't see financial help coming. And even if financial help were to come, I can't see the Syrian economy able to benefit and to capitalize on it. So yeah, the prospects are not good from that point of view.
Yeah, Chad, you draw a very negative picture, which of course reflects reality. Maybe we will go back to this economic discourse later. Now let me turn to Charles. Speaking of the US, we can't help observing some contradictions sometimes. For instance, in the past month, the US has sponsored indirectly energy deals between Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. But at the same time, the Biden administration has openly criticized the latest steps towards this process of Syria's normalization. Since you apparently are the American voice in this panel, how do you think the White House will come to terms with these different stances, and what kind of an approach is Biden applying to Syria, and more in general? This example makes us reflect on what is the real weight, the real importance of this normalization discourse. I mean, beyond symbolic gestures that have been made lately, what should we expect to see concretely for real in the nearest future? Charles, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent questions. And I have to say, I agree very much with what Lina and Jihad have said so far. So first off, despite my accent, I am an American, so I'll try and speak on behalf of on behalf of the US, at least my perception of US policy at the moment. And of course, it's no surprise to anyone here that contradictory US foreign policy is not necessarily anything new. It's certainly not unique to the current administration. What I would say is, when the Biden administration came into office, I think most of the big foreign policy decision makers were quite determined that the Middle East was going to take a step down the ladder in terms of priority. Of course, publicly, the administration made no secret of the fact that great power competition was going to be, the number one, the number two, and the number three priority of American foreign policy. And that was pointing us primarily in the direction of China and perhaps also at Russia. And so in that respect, Syria, was never really necessarily a top priority, but it dramatically fell. And so did most of the Middle East. And in that sense, I think the sort of underpinning philosophy of the administration has been containment, a kind of one-handed containment policy. And that goes for Syria as much as it does for many other issues across the region, from Palestine to Yemen to Iraq to Iranian regional behavior and what have you. So when we're talking about Syria policy, I think that is largely why two of the Biden administration's core pillars for Syria, humanitarian and countering ISIS, have been both consistent and publicly voiced. Now, of course, they're important, humanitarian and countering ISIS, but they're both treating symptoms of the crisis. And they're both treating symptoms of the crisis that, from a US policy perspective, are the symptoms that are most likely to threaten US interests in Syria, in the region, and potentially further afield. So that was the administration's kind of initial assumption when it came in. And from that perspective, the shifting of tectonic plates that we've seen in the region, the engagement between multiple different governments with other governments that have previously been at odds in previous years, all of that reshifting in the region is seen by the Biden administration as a good thing, even if it is states re-engaging with states that we don't like. The fact that people are talking and engaging on a greater level than they were 2 or 3 years ago is seen within the administration as a good thing, because talking means they're not fighting. Talking means that the prospects for instability are reduced. And I think for some in the Biden administration, that is why we saw the regional energy deal pushed and prioritized, not because we wanted to see the Assad regime normalized or even re-engaged, but the idea that the region was coming together in arrangements like this is seen as a kind of de-escalatory development. And so the principle of non-engagement with Damascus remained, but the idea of regional mechanisms was encouraged. Now, if you want my personal opinion on that, I think it's naive. I think the idea that we can encourage or give a green light to the region to engage with someone like the Assad regime is, in the short term, perhaps looks advantageous for regional stability, but in the long term, it's sending all the wrong messages, which is why we find ourselves in these contradictory positions with our traditional allies in the region complaining at us for being, as you say, unpredictable, inconsistent, and what have you. So I think it's problematic, but it speaks to the fact that the administration was determined to prioritize other global issues. Sort of briefly, what has re-engaging with the regime brought? I mean, in the case of Jordan, Captagon seizures and Captagon crossing across the border has rocketed in 2022. In the 6 months since King Abdullah spoke with Bashar al-Assad, we've seen more Captagon seized along the Jordanian border than in all of 2020 and 2021 combined. So from a Jordanian perspective, one of the key things they wanted to resolve has got significantly worse. And of course, refugees, as we've heard from Jordan's foreign minister Safadi several times over the last 6 months, there's just no prospect of refugees returning to Syria from Jordan. So I think there was also a realization that re-engagement was only ever going to bring, so much in terms of any return. And then finally, I think that we might be seeing an interesting change here in Washington in that for the first 12 months, the Biden administration's Syria policy was driven primarily from the White House, from the National Security Council, and primarily on the understanding that a quiet bilateral engagement between the US and Russia might eventually bring the framework for a meaningful political process or some kind of a settlement or an understanding. Now, with Ukraine, that's off the table. And we have seen the State Department assume much more leadership on Syria policy over the last few months. And the State Department's instincts on Syria, I think, are much better. They tend towards multilateralism, they tend towards long-term diplomacy, and they protect values and principles of non-engagement and anti-normalization, which also perhaps explains why we've seen this contradiction that you describe. But ultimately, when we're talking about normalizing or re-engagement, when we're talking about sanctions, the one thing from a US perspective we all need to be aware of right now is in November this year are the US midterm elections. And every single poll out there says that the Republicans are almost certain to take back both sides of the House and the Senate. And that puts them totally in the driving seat on foreign policy. And it means that the Biden administration's fairly relaxed attitude to the Caesar Act over the last 12 months is going to change. And so all of this normalizing re-engagement behavior will, I imagine, be cracked down upon much more aggressively from Washington once Republicans are in charge in Congress and will be enforcing a congressional law. It is not a political law. It's nothing to do with the White House. The Caesar Act is enforced by Congress. And I do think that's going to be a game changer to some of this behavior, but also a reason why we've not seen re-engagement turn into normalizing, as my two colleagues have said so far.
Thank you, Charles. Very interesting, and thank you for clarifying a few things for us. You also you touch upon this idea of yes, on one side you need some sort of dialogue, also as an alternative to war and distance. But what does this mean in the long term for the Syrians? Which brings us back to what Lina was saying about the fact that the key driver is always domestic, and the politics of Syria is made by the Syrians after all. So Lina, I will go back to you, and I would ask you, in what way has the process of Arab normalization, this process of normalization with Damascus, influenced the prospects of resolution of the political Syrian conflict, the political situation in the country. Do you think it will cast a shadow over the peace process, or will it boost peace, or do you think it will have zero impact on the peace process of the country? How do you see it?
Okay. First, let me clarify, because I'm afraid you've flipped what I meant to say when I said domestic. When I said domestic, I wasn't talking about Syrian domestic drivers. I was saying domestic, meaning domestic Jordanian and domestic UAE, because the dynamics in those countries domestically are what have been behind their normalization kind of trajectories. In Jordan, it's the pressure felt by the royal family and the king in particular that's driven by the interests of the business community. And in UAE, it's UAE's own ambitions to become a regional leader. And I say this because it's an important clarification, because it's linked to your question just now, which is about actually the peace process and Syrians. I'm afraid that, unfortunately, in all this discussion, there has been an absence of Syrian voices, an absence of consideration for Syrian citizen interests. And that's why I'm saying, when we talk about this issue of normalization, it's not really about Syrians or Syria. It's mostly about the interests of these other countries and what they want to achieve, whether, in terms of economic interests within their own country to retain some sort of internal stability, or geopolitical ambitions, which is the case of UAE. So when it comes to the Syrians themselves, how have they been impacted by this? Well, if you are someone who is in the Syrian regime, as we just heard, the Syrian regime kind of loyalists and members have welcomed these normalization efforts. And it's not just because of the money issue, because as Jihad pointed out very rightly, the money is not going to be all that much. But there's the very important issue of legitimacy here, because the more other countries and entities engage with the Syrian regime, the more the regime can sell itself as legitimate. Domestically, here we are now talking domestically inside Syria, but also regionally. And this is an important aspect because the regime is craving legitimacy. I mean, some efforts over the years have been, frankly, a bit laughable, such as the very famous meeting with the leader of Abkhazia, and people going, what on earth is that? And where on earth is that country? And it just showed how at that time, the regime was so desperate to show that any international entity is engaging with it. So when you have a visit, an official visit to UAE, this is huge at the level of legitimacy and optics. When it comes to the peace process, I'm afraid, from what I can see from my own interactions with the people involved, it's still more or less just about kept alive, but it has not really progressed anywhere. And this is where we have to, again, go back to Charles and the US, because I've been saying this for years, and I still say it, that I don't think that the Syrian conflict is going to be resolved through the UN peace process. I think the UN peace process can be a mechanism to implement a peace deal for Syria. However, the starting point has to be in Washington. And that has not happened for all kinds of reasons. And therefore, this normalization, etc., is not really connected to the peace deal. It's not like as a result of this talk about normalization, suddenly the Syrian opposition is going to say, you know what, we no longer care that, we've been in exile for ages and that lots of people have died and have been, displaced. We're fine because everybody is normalizing, we might as well. Of course, some profiteers might say that, but generally speaking, it's not going to be that kind of trajectory. Maybe the Syrian regime hopes that with the legitimacy issue, the peace process will eventually die. I think that would be the preferred scenario for the regime. However, with the US not budging, that's not going to happen either. So unfortunately, I'm here talking about continuing this low-level peace process that, again, is reduced to, as Charles said, looking at the symptoms rather than trying to solve the causes. And that's because there's no political leverage on part of the entities involved in the peace process under the UN umbrella, I'm afraid. So we go back to Washington on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. Now, Jihad, let's go back a little bit to the economic side of the story. We mentioned the war in Ukraine. In what way has this conflict in Eastern Europe impacted on Syria, and in what ways it will impact on Syria in the future? We said it, a terrible war that will probably remain with us for a long time, and whose global consequences will certainly remain with us for a long time. And when it comes to Syria, for instance, what consequences have we seen in terms of the rise of the wheat prices, the fuel prices, and what are the consequences on the local Syrian population from your perspective and experience?
Yes. Well, Chiara, for now, the impact hasn't been very significant. Most oil Syria is buying it on credit from Iran, and it hasn't yet increased. It hasn't increased the price of most oil products, not all of them, but most of them, mainly Mazout, hasn't been increased. In terms of wheat supplies, again, we haven't seen significant impact yet. Now, wheat stocks are low in Syria, although Syria is a wheat-growing country, but local production is not sufficient, and then you have logistical issues and so on and so forth. So I don't think, if you want, here is the main issue today. Of course, if the conflict were to last a long time, because Syria does rely on wheat imports from the Black Sea, from both Ukraine and Russia. So if the conflict were to last a long time, we may see an important consequence, but so far it's not very significant. The problem lies somewhere else, in many other ways. In one way, for once, I think the Syrians use, to some extent, the Russian banking sector to transact with the outside world, and this is something they are losing because of the Western sanctions on the Russian banking sector. So that's a negative impact. Another negative impact is the fact that Syrian banks, the Syrian government, held some assets in Russian banks. We don't know how much, I don't have the number, but this also may be impacted by the sanctions and the conflict in general. The third aspect is that Russia was among the very few countries that lent some financial support to Syria. We have seen a recent report indicating that Russia lent around $700 million in 2021 to Syria. And this is also likely going to stop given the financial difficulties the Russians are facing. But more significantly, I think for now, the risks for the Syrian regime are more political than economic. One concern for them is, of course, the fact that Syria is not going to be an area of focus for the Russian. It's not clear yet, of course. We have to see how the conflict is going to evolve. But there is certainly today this perception that Russia is focused on Ukraine. Syria may be a card in its negotiation with other parties, particularly Turkey, for example, because I think one needs also, that's something important, which is that for Russia, I think today relations with Turkey are strategic. Turkey is the only NATO country with which which has set its airspace open to Russian aircraft, and there is a concern that this proximity or some form of dependency may have an impact on the Syria scene. It is true that the Turks are more concerned with the Kurds, but there it's not really the Russians that have the upper hand. It's really the Americans that have the last say. So I think there's a concern from that perspective. And generally, Russia's isolation is not seen necessarily very, very positively because Russia was also was perceived at least as being an intermediary in mending ties between Syria and some part of Europe, at least some Eastern European countries, for example. And this is a leverage the Russians are going to lose. On the other hand, statements like the one Putin made a few days ago about the fact that the Western media was faking the massacres committed, and he compared this with the chemical attacks, this plays in favor of the Syrian regime, because in a way it had put it in the same position than the Moscow is. But from a strictly economic point of view, for now the impact has not been significant. But this is going to show only at a later stage. I think probably the second half of this year, and even more significantly at the beginning of 2023.
Thank you very much, Jihad. Charles, I will come to you with the last question before opening up to our audience. We've been talking about the far-reaching consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine, and among these are also the general worsening of the humanitarian situation inside Syria. We said the rise of wheat prices, food prices, but also the threat that of a Russian veto on cross-border aid at the UN Security Council. We know that Russia has been skeptical over the years about aid flows through neighboring countries, because Moscow believes this complex operations would be a threat to Syrian sovereignty. What approach should the international community apply to assist the Syrian population? What priorities should the US and Europe set for their Syrian policies? And I see there is also some questions in the Q&A about these humanitarian aspects. So Charles, over to you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, another important question on an issue that's only going to become more and more acute and important in the coming months. So first off, you mentioned the Russian potential cross-border veto. Everything I'm hearing from stakeholders at the UN and in the Security Council is that veto is now almost guaranteed, or at least that's what they understand. And I think, any of us who are working on Syria, concerned about Syria, should be enormously concerned about what that means. At least 3.5 million people are sort of urgently reliant on that assistance. The moment that stops, as we understood last time there was a vote, we were provided many statistics in the public about what would happen, but about 80% of the supplies that are essentially keeping people from starvation would almost instantaneously vanish from the market in northwestern Syria, and the humanitarian crisis that will result would be enormous. Already today, the World Food Programme is cutting the size of its food baskets into northern Syria as a result of rising food prices following on from the war in Ukraine. So we're already seeing the Ukraine impact in terms of the UN and UN associated bodies' ability to feed people who are 100% reliant on assistance. But the moment that stops, we really will have a significant crisis on our hands. Now, what do we do going ahead? I mean, I know that late last year, early this year, there was a number of different tracks of engagement, of consultation between different stakeholder governments about potential alternative cross-border mechanisms. This is always an issue that stakeholders have refused to talk about publicly. They don't want the Russian government to think that we have alternatives, because therefore it might encourage a veto more than they might have already considered it. But those discussions have been ongoing. Now, I do worry, though, that with the war in Ukraine, bandwidth has been precipitously cut, bandwidth on Syria. I do worry whether or not any of those consultations had reached the kind of stage that we would hope for them to have reached in order for us to be prepared for a Russian veto. And I wouldn't count on us being in a position to replace or anywhere near to replace what might be cut. So my proposal, I mean, I wrote a policy paper on which touched on most of this just a month or two ago. What I think that we should be doing is thinking much more strategically about how we provide aid and what kind of aid we're providing. It's kind of remarkable that we're in the 12th year of the Syrian crisis, and our aid response is still emergency assistance. To put it bluntly, we're still providing tents and food baskets 12 years into this crisis. And we have, for largely political reasons, refused to consider the idea of building semi-permanent structures for displaced people. Instead, we continue to provide tents. And the prospect of providing strategic assistance for farmers, for small and local businesses to subsist and sustain themselves on a local basis has barely touched the policy level. So my proposal is to get much more strategic about the kinds of assistance we're providing. It should not be the case that, just this past winter, people were still freezing to death in tents in IDP camps that have existed for 7 or 8 years. And so that's an issue that we can correct quickly. And if the prospect of a cross-border veto is on the table, and if donors are going to increasingly be diverting money to Ukraine and away from Syria, then we need to be using less resources much more strategically and focusing on sustainability rather than emergency response. And that's what I call a kind of freeze and build approach to northern Syria. Again, the other aspect of that is that the conflict lines across northern Syria have been frozen for years. Yes, there is tit for tat sort of mortaring across borders from time to time, but the lines of control haven't changed for at least 2 to 3 years. We should be taking advantage of that to become more strategic about the kinds of aid and assistance that we're providing. And yes, some of that aid should be stabilization and targeted reconstruction. But that's the kind of discussion we ought to be having right now when we are assuming that we will be providing less resources into an area of even greater need in the coming months and sadly, probably the coming years.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Thank you all our speakers. Now we have about 10-15 minutes to answer a few of the many questions that arrived in the chat. I will try maybe to gather them, to collect 3 of them, and then allow for another round of interventions, of answers from our speakers. So we have a question from Jan Mens asking what kind, this is addressed to anyone, but perhaps more for Charles, what kind of concrete leverage could the US have on the peace process? And somehow relates also to Fabrizio Leva's questions on would the US negotiate with Russia a political support for Anis Rojava in order to keep the current administrative autonomy? Question mark. Another question from Alia Mubayed, and this is for jihad specifically. What are the potential economic gains that Arab Gulf monarchies are expecting to reap from Russia's normalization with the Assad regime? And a question to Lina. You mentioned that a political solution for Syria cannot be achieved through the UN, but rather by Washington. Can you elaborate a bit more on that? So there is a question for each, but you feel free to pick on any points that have been made, and perhaps we will go again through the same order as before. So Lina, starting with you.
Okay. Well, very simply, the reason why I say that is because Russia and the Syrian regime have never taken the UN peace process seriously. They have always used it as a way to buy time. And we've seen this over the years. For example, a ceasefire would be declared, and then they would breach it. And, it's kind of a continuous cycle because they would use the kind of ceasefire negotiations to, in a way, reposition troops and then engage in attacks. They eventually were counting on fatigue on part of the international community, that eventually everyone's going to be tired of this protracted process and go, you know what, Assad is there, he has survived, so he's there to stay, and we're just going to have to accept it. So that's what Russia and the Assad regime have been counting on. And that's why they have practically been, I will say, bluffing throughout the peace process. And that's why it's not going to go anywhere for as long as they don't feel compelled to change their behavior. And I personally am against any idea that says the Syrian regime will need to modify its behavior. I don't think this regime is capable of modifying anything. Just like Russia has shown us with its attack on Ukraine, that it is also beyond modifying its behavior for as long as Putin's regime is in power. So let's not kid ourselves. I think the West, to be honest, has been quite self-serving. very often over the last decade or so in turning a blind eye to these very clear signs that I'm talking about. And here we are with Ukraine, seeing very vividly what Russia has been showing us in Syria for the last, several years. And so that's why I think the only thing that will compel Russia to take some sort of deal seriously is if there is serious US pressure. And we're seeing this in a way play out, although of course in a different way, in Ukraine right now. And I think, what happens in Ukraine is probably going to be the most significant factor that could impact what will happen in Syria further down the line. But I think very, very importantly, dealing decisively with Russia is needed. All this appeasement of Russia that we've seen over the years has obviously not helped Syria and certainly not helped Ukraine. So I would link the two issues as well. Thanks.
Jihad, over to you.
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Chiara, and thank you to Alia. Hi to Alia. Thanks for the question. I don't think the approach of the Emiratis or the Gulf is economically driven. There are very few economic opportunities for Gulf investors in Syria. Prior to 2011, Gulf investment, mostly UAE, Qatari, and Saudi, overwhelmingly went to real estate acquisition, to real estate assets, because it was a time of cash surpluses in the Gulf region. This is not really today interested in acquiring land at a low cost, but this would be for a very long-term investment. Other assets could be, specifically here, I'm thinking of the Emiratis, control over one of the two ports on the Mediterranean. DP World may be interested. Now the port of Latakia is up for renegotiation in 2 or 3 years' time. The port of Tartus is under Russian management for a long period of time, but the Russians may want to resell it, for instance. So there may be here some opportunities. Other than that, I don't think there's really anything very significant. Prior to 2011, there were some talks of potential interest in shipping Qatari gas through Syria, Syria being mainly a transit country for energy products, but this was really never seriously considered. Even the Qatari never really negotiated, to my knowledge, at least in much details, because this would have to go through Saudi Arabia. Any gas pipeline. So I can't see significant today interest of the Gulf from an economic angle. I think that the ambition of countries such as the UAE is simply at this stage, to have a stake in Syria. It is not necessarily to counter the Iranians or to counter the Turks, for instance. I think for the Emiratis, the Turks are as much a challenge as the Iranians, even if there is some form of rapprochement. But they don't necessarily are not necessarily asking the Syrian regime to distance itself from the Iranians, but they are simply seeking to have a stake in a country which remains important, which has a border with Turkey, a NATO country, which is on the Mediterranean, which has a border with Israel. So that's how I see it. But in terms of economic and financial gains for the Gulf in Syria, I can't see anything very significant today.
Thanks, Jihad. Chas, now over to you.
So thanks to the listeners for the questions. The question on US leverage in the police process is the billion-dollar question we've been asking since 2012. There can be no doubt that the US, through its own actions and inaction, has reduced or damaged its position of leverage over recent years, and that's unfortunate. But I think it would be a mistake to think that we didn't have some meaningful leverage still potentially to play. I think Lina was right, in implying that the war in Ukraine and the Western response to that may potentially prove to be an interesting spanner in the works, in that I don't think Russia saw us responding in the way that we have. Certainly the military assistance that NATO states have been sending to Ukraine will have been a very big shock to the Russian system. And if we're talking about sort of Ukraine, let's also remember that from a Russian perspective, Syria was never just about Syria. Syria was always one component of a much bigger chessboard that Russia saw itself playing in. From a Western perspective, Syria was only ever about Syria, which is largely why policymakers long said Syria is not actually all that important to us, therefore our policy will remain limited. That was a mistake. Now, I think in our response to Ukraine, we are now playing on a bigger chessboard, and we may potentially have an opportunity to also tie Syria into that bigger chessboard, rather than looking at things in specific sort of isolated subsets. So I would say that it would be a mistake to answer a question on Syria in this respect without talking about things like Ukraine. I think we should be holding the line in Ukraine. If anything, I think we should be pushing harder to push that point. We have a whole set of red lines, global norms, whatever we want to call them, that we need to redraw. Ever since the early 2000s, when we allowed, through appeasement, concession, risk aversion, and again, whatever you want to call it, we allowed those red lines and global norms to be eroded. Now, it's going to be a hard process to redraw them, but Ukraine, I think, does give us an opportunity. But it also gives us an opportunity to pressure Russia. Somewhat remarkable that despite all of Russia's crimes in Syria, the US has never sanctioned Russia for Syria once. There's not a single sanction on Russia for anything it's done in Syria, which is completely stunning. But we can, and we are having that kind of an effect through Ukraine, and I think we should push that further. And without plugging my paper again, I do think a kind of freeze and build approach to freezing the conflict lines, being much more strategic about the kinds of assistance we're providing in order to create a much more viable alternative in northern Syria. And I'm talking about the northeast and across parts of the northwest, a much more viable and sustainable alternative to what the regime currently offers. And I expect the regime's offering is going to look worse and worse over time, not better. Notwithstanding any of this regional engagement we've talked about. I think that would actually increase our leverage over time if we got really serious about that. This is a strategic patience approach. We're not going to see a political settlement in 6 or 12 months' time. We may not even see one in 5 years' time. So why not acknowledge that and build something that makes that eventual political settlement more meaningful and more just, rather than continuing to hope something might happen next month and kicking the can down the road and seeing our leverage reduced. So that's the answer to the one question. And briefly on the, if I understood it correctly, would the US and Russia ever negotiate over Rojava autonomy? No, I don't think so. I mean, for now, there is no US-Russian meaningful diplomatic contact on almost anything internationally because of Ukraine. I don't necessarily see that changing anytime soon. And from a Russian perspective, negotiating the autonomy of northeastern Syria would kill its relationship in Damascus and any influence or leverage it might have there. So I don't see that as something that's realistic. But I do think that the US and allies have it in their capacity to allow the Northeast to become de facto autonomous, even if it's not officially forever, through that kind of freeze and build approach that I've laid out.
Thank you, Charles. I think if we may have time for another couple of questions if we keep answers very short. So Marina Sanchez is asking if if you believe whether there will be significant improvements in the JCPOA that will probably foster this trend towards Arab normalization. Ahmed Ghazal is asking, but we've talked about Russia already a lot, and Lina already partially addressed this point. If you see Russia going towards more engagement or disengagement faced to this Ukrainian debacle. And Luca Zotti is asking to draw some parallels between the crisis in Syria and the crisis in Lebanon, if there is any. What are the relationships between the crisis in these two neighboring countries? We have to be very brief, so perhaps only pick on the points that you want to address, and not all of them. Otherwise, we will run out of time. Lina, I will start with you. Just 1 minute, if you wish.
Yeah, sure. On the JCPOA. personally, I'm still not convinced that it's going to happen. This negotiation has been rocky, to say the least. And in any case, for me, I've been saying this again for years, the problem has been that the international community has completely detached negotiating with Iran over the nuclear issue from addressing Iran's regional role. And that has allowed Iran to expand and deepen its engagement in the Levant, meaning in Lebanon and Syria. And this relates to the other question of how the two countries kind of are overlapping in this big crisis, the role of Iran being one. The second is the financial crisis in Lebanon that has definitely also affected the situation in Syria. So the two files are closely linked in that regard. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina. Jihad, if you want to pick on any of those points very briefly, 1 minute.
Yeah, and I will just talk about the links between the Lebanese and Syrian economic and financial crisis. I think it is important to know that for a lot of, Lebanon represents a major banking center for the Syrian economy. A lot of Syrians hold assets, held deposits in Lebanese banks, and have lost tremendous amount of money. We're talking of billions of dollars. I personally know myself a number of Syrian friends here in Paris who had their money in Lebanon and lived from that money, and today don't have money left anymore. Lebanon also served as helped divert if you want, the sanction regime imposed on Syria. So a lot of traders would do trading through Lebanese banks, something they cannot do anymore. And if you look actually at the collapse of the Syrian and Lebanese currencies starting the summer, at the end of the summer of 2019, you see a very similar trend between the two currencies. The collapse of the Syrian currency post Lebanese banking crisis was as significant within a year as the collapse of the currency during the previous 10 years. So it says something about how much the Syrian economy has lost from this Lebanese banking crisis. A lot of even Syrian state institutions had their money in Lebanese banks and cannot use it anymore to import wheat or other items. So the impact has been really dramatic, and you see this in everyday life in terms of Syrian savings and purchasing power.
Thank you, Jihad. Charles, you can have the last word if you want.
Okay, yeah, briefly on the JCPOA thing. So first off, I think Lena's right. I don't know if we're actually going to see a JCPOA at this point, given some of the things I heard last night. But I think, if we did have a JCPOA, I actually think that would reduce the incentives for normalization. I think speaking with many stakeholders in the region who were considering re-engaging with Damascus, they were doing that to preempt a JCPOA and a surge in capacity and resources of the IRGC and the Quds Force, the kind of actors that they saw as competitors and as adversaries in Syria. Now, if there was a JCPOA, the IRGC would have much more of a capacity to sort of resurge or reconsolidate its position in Syria. I actually think if there isn't a JCPOA, the actors interested or already engaging with Damascus would have more of an incentive to do that, because in their minds, at least, whether this is correct or not, in their minds, Iran would still be in a position of sort of relative weakness, or at least not as strong and as well resourced as they would be if there was a nuclear deal and the sanctions were dropped off. So I actually think if there isn't a JCPOA, there'll be more of an incentive for the kinds of re-engagements we've seen so far. Whereas if there was, I actually think some of these actors would cut their losses and cease to see competing with Iran as a realistic objective in Syria.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you, everyone. We must close now as we have another events going on in a while. I wish to thank you all, our speakers and our participants, for the fascinating questions and interventions. You helped us navigating through the complexity of this subject and this process that we're witnessing, and I'm sure you helped us and a lot of people made some clarity about important issues, and I look forward to seeing you very soon, hopefully in person. And thank you again for being with us, and goodbye, and see you next time.
Thank you.